The airport was buzzing that morning. People shuffled between terminals with coffee cups and cabin bags, oblivious to the silent moments unfolding around them. But one person noticed. At gate A29, a black single mother named Mariah stood quietly, her toddler balanced on one hip and a folded stroller at her side. Her clothes were neat but worn. Her energy was stretched thin. She had been awake for over 24 hours, navigating delays and missed connections. Her eyes were heavy, but her hands were firm, holding her baby boy close as he sniffled from the cold. She had just been told her economy seat was double booked, and she'd now be put on standby, unless someone voluntarily gave up a seat. The airline agent had already moved on, barely sparing her a look of sympathy, but someone in the first-class lounge had watched the entire scene unfold through the tinted glass. Benjamin Carter didn't look like a typical billionaire. No flashy suits, no gold watches. Just a navy hoodie, jeans, and the kind of quiet presence that came from having everything yet needing very little. He owned real estate in 7 countries and had just closed a $1 billion sustainability deal in Singapore. But today, he was on a red-eye back to New York for his late mother's charity gala, a cause that meant more to him than any boardroom trophy. He stood up. With no fanfare, no words, and no explanations, he walked up to the gate agent and handed over his boarding pass. Within minutes, Mariah's name was called. She was confused, but grateful, and soon found herself in seat 1A, first class. The seat was spacious, the cushions soft, and for the first time in days, her baby curled up on her chest and slept. Mariah looked out the window, unsure why this stranger had given up such comfort for someone like her. She didn't know his name. All she knew was that someone had seen her. The plane took off, but fate doesn't leave gestures of kindness hanging in midair. A few minutes into the flight, turbulence hit. Not the kind that rattles drink carts, the kind that shakes engines. Passengers gasped, seatbelts snapped tight, and a flight attendant nearly fell. Panic swept the cabin like wildfire. And in that panic, Benjamin, now seated way back in economy, middle seat between 2 arguing travelers, realized something was deeply wrong. The flight attendant's face turned pale as she rushed toward the cockpit. No one knew what was happening. A technical failure, a pressure drop, the words thrown around meant little, but Mariah knew one thing. Her baby was wheezing. Not from fear, but from his chronic asthma. His small chest heaved. She rummaged through her diaper bag only to realize the inhaler was left at security in her rush. Her hands trembled. Her voice cracked. She pressed the call button again and again, but in the panic, no one noticed. Until Benjamin turned around. He stood up, scanned the length of the plane, and spotted her distress. Saw the way she cradled her son and rocked him. Helpless, something inside him ignited. But before he could act, she stood. Mariah didn't scream. She didn't cry. With steady legs, she unbuckled and walked calmly down the aisle, even as the plane shook. Her son needed air. He needed medicine. And she needed someone to help her reach the oxygen tank stored up front, reserved for emergencies. The crew tried to stop her, but she didn't break stride. She reached the front of the plane, opened the emergency panel, and retrieved the oxygen mask. In a moment that none of the cameras on board missed, she pressed the mask over her son's face and held it there until his breathing calmed. It was her calm that saved him. Not the wealth around her, not the airline's comfort, not even Benjamin's seat. But Benjamin had given her a place from which to act, a place with faster access, a place with power. When the flight eventually landed safely, an ambulance was waiting, but her child was stable. And Benjamin? He slipped away quietly, like the wind that carries the wings of a plane. But the video didn't stay quiet. A passenger had recorded the moment she walked through the shaking plane with fearless resolve. By morning, it had gone viral. Headlines read, "Single mother saves child mid-flight, thanks to stranger's first-class seat." But that wasn't the twist. The twist came when Benjamin's identity was revealed. People wanted to know who the quiet man was that gave up his seat and disappeared into coach. And they found him. Within hours, social media was ablaze with comparisons. A billionaire, unnoticed. A black, single mom, underestimated. But together, they proved that decency doesn't need permission, and Mariah, she did something no one expected. Mariah sat alone in her small apartment the next day, the morning light filtering through beige curtains that had seen better days. Her son was asleep on the couch, his chest rising steadily, the wheezing finally gone. She held a warm cup of tea in her hands, but her mind was far from calm. Her phone was lighting up constantly. Messages, calls, emails, and even reporters standing outside the building. What had begun as a moment of desperation in a stormy flight had turned into something much bigger. People were calling her brave, some calling her reckless. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that her son was alive, and that a stranger had noticed her in a way no one had in years. Then came the email. It was from a firm she didn't recognize. At first glance, it looked like a scam, but the signature at the bottom carried the weight of truth. Carter Global Initiatives. The name meant little to most, but it was Benjamin Carter's empire, bigger than tech, real estate, or philanthropy. It was a brand of quiet power. The email wasn't a request. It wasn't even a thank you. It was a proposal. She was being invited to speak at an upcoming Women's Leadership Summit in D.C., hosted and funded entirely by Carter Global. And more than that, they wanted her to become a voice for single mothers within the foundation's new outreach program. Flights, accommodation, honorarium, childcare, all taken care of. Mariah stared at the screen in disbelief. Not long ago, she was scrubbing floors in people's homes, trying to survive day to day. Now, someone wanted to hear her story. Not pity her, not save her, just listen. She didn't say yes immediately. Instead, she spent the day feeding her son, calling her sister to come babysit, and gathering the courage to walk into a world that had never let her through the door. The flight to D.C. felt different. This time, she didn't wear worn-out sneakers and a faded hoodie. She wore a blue blazer passed down from a church friend and sat in a window seat with quiet dignity. As she looked out at the clouds, she wasn't thinking about survival. She was thinking about purpose. At the summit, the crowd was full of suits and stilettos, people who lived in a completely different reality. But when Mariah stepped up to the podium and shared her story, not just about the plane, but about raising a child alone in a city that rarely offered kindness, a hush fell over the room. She didn't cry. She didn't dramatize. She simply told the truth. And at the back of the hall, in the shadows, Benjamin Carter watched. He hadn't told anyone he'd be attending. He wasn't there for applause. He was there because he wanted to be reminded why he'd given up that seat. And in Mariah's words, he found that answer 100 times over. She spoke for women with no platform. She spoke for those who had been invisible for far too long. And when the applause rose, it wasn't for the drama of the flight. It was for the quiet courage of a woman who had refused to let struggle define her. After the summit, people lined up to meet her. Some cried, others asked how they could help. But Mariah wasn't looking for charity. She was building something. And that night, alone in her hotel room overlooking the Capitol, she made a decision. She would not fade into the background again. The small compensation she received from the summit, she started an initiative. Wings for One, a support group for single mothers traveling with children, offering everything from donated strollers to prepaid flights for emergency cases. It started local, but word spread fast. Benjamin Carter never tried to claim credit. But he did something else. One morning, Mariah received a letter. It wasn't digital. It was handwritten, and inside it was a check. Not just for her initiative, but for the life she was trying to build. No branding, no conditions. Just a note. Because you were ready to walk through the turbulence. She didn't cry when she read it. She smiled, because kindness, once given, doesn't stay still. It moves, it builds, it multiplies, and all of it, every single ripple, started from a man giving up his seat and a woman refusing to sit down when her child needed air. The city didn't notice at first. After all, movements rarely arrive with fireworks. They begin in whispers, in community centers, church basements, small-town libraries, and whispered phone calls between mothers who are tired of carrying the world alone. That's how Wings for One grew. Not by Mariah standing on stages, but by sitting in circle groups, holding other mothers' hands, and asking one simple question: what do you need to breathe again? Within 6 months, Mariah had a waiting list of mothers from 5 states. Her phone rang constantly. Local news covered her efforts once, then national media picked it up. But Mariah didn't chase cameras. She chased solutions. Benjamin Carter continued to watch from afar. He funded a few operations quietly: childcare vans, emergency shelters, even a mental health counseling line, but he never asked for recognition. He understood that Mariah was no longer a symbol of pity or survival. She was a blueprint for how strength looks when no one is looking. One day, Mariah received a message that left her breathless. She was invited to attend the National Civic Forum, a televised roundtable of innovators, policymakers, and social impact leaders. At first, she thought it was a mistake, but they hadn't chosen her for theatrics. They'd chosen her because Wings for One had done what no think tank or politician had managed: give dignity back to mothers who had lost it in the cracks of the system. That night, she stood on the same carpet as senators and CEOs. She didn't wear designer clothes. She wore a simple white dress and carried her old handbag, because for her, nothing had changed. She was still a mother first. The moderator introduced her as the accidental face of airline equality, referencing the viral video from nearly a year ago. But as the cameras rolled, Mariah corrected them. "This wasn't about airline seats," she said. "It was about someone seeing me before I disappeared. That seat didn't change my life. What changed everything was what I did after I sat down." The crowd went silent. Because they understood. Because they, too, had once needed someone to stand for them. And now they were watching a woman stand for thousands. Back in New York, Benjamin saw the broadcast in his penthouse office. Alone. Lights dimmed. He leaned back in his chair and allowed a rare smile to touch his face. He had spent most of his life trying to prove success with numbers, deals, and digital footprints, but none of it ever reached the depth of what he'd seen in that moment. It wasn't the money that changed Mariah's world, it was the chance. And now she was building chances for others. Soon, companies began to partner with her. Airlines donated tickets. Women-owned businesses offered job training. Even airports began installing Wings lounges, dedicated rest zones for traveling mothers and kids. Mariah's name spread, but she remained rooted. She still lived in her modest apartment, still packed her son's lunch herself, still answered every email from a mother in distress, even when her inbox flooded like a river after the storm. Because she remembered. She remembered the cold of that airport floor, the uncertainty, the moment no one cared, except one man. And then came the day she met Benjamin again. The event was quiet, private, not broadcast, not recorded, just a gathering of changemakers hosted at a restored art gallery in Manhattan, a place where marble met memory and walls spoke in textures. Mariah had received the invitation in a gold-trimmed envelope weeks ago. No logo, just a line. To those who gave others wings. She hesitated at first. She had walked many stages by now. But this one felt different. Something in her spirit told her this wasn't about applause. This was about something unfinished. When she arrived, dressed in an emerald gown borrowed from a local designer who supported her cause, the room fell into a hush. Not because she was famous, but because she carried presence. The kind of presence that only people who've seen hardship and chosen to rise carry. Benjamin Carter was already inside. He stood near a vintage sculpture of a phoenix, dressed not in billionaire armor, but a simple tailored suit with a lapel pin shaped like a wing. The room was filled with chatter, but the moment their eyes met, silence wrapped them both. Not because there were sparks, but because there was recognition. They didn't need words. She walked over. He extended a hand, not in ownership, not in debt, but in mutual respect. They sat in a corner where sunlight spilled in through stained glass windows. Mariah spoke first, sharing how Wings for One had now helped over 14,000 mothers across the country. How a recent case helped reunite a refugee mother with her children after a delayed flight nearly cost them their visas. She didn't boast. She spoke with the steady cadence of someone who knew every number was a heartbeat. Benjamin listened, not as a benefactor, but as a witness. Then he did something unexpected. He handed her a leather-bound journal. Inside were handwritten letters, testimonies from women helped by her movement. Stories of mothers who had given birth alone and found help, of women who found the courage to apply for jobs again, of children who now dreamed of planes instead of fearing them. And at the back of the journal, his own letter. He hadn't planned to give it to her in person, but watching her speak, watching the way others looked at her, he realized she wasn't someone who should be supported quietly anymore. She was someone whose fire needed to be seen. In the letter, he explained why he gave up the seat that day. It wasn't out of pity. It wasn't because of some corporate mission. It was because he had watched her, tired, holding her child, and had seen his own mother, who had once worked 2 jobs just to keep their lights on. He had been the child on that hip once, and giving up his seat wasn't charity. It was returning something that was once given to him. Mariah didn't cry when she read it, but she folded the journal with care as if it contained something sacred. They parted that night with no cameras, no contracts, just a quiet understanding that sometimes the greatest revolutions don't need noise, they need kindness, courage, and follow-through. Years later, Wings for One became a global foundation. Mariah's son grew up hearing the story not of a flight gone wrong, but of a day the world paused to make space for his mother. In schools, her story was taught alongside lessons of modern civic impact. And Benjamin, he never reclaimed that first-class seat. Not in the sky, not in the headlines. He had found something better, a front-row seat to change. Because on that flight he gave up comfort. But what he got in return was legacy.
If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me bring more heartfelt stories to life, one soul at a time.